Hi and welcome to another story, and today we have part 1 of Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. Starting from the very beginning, chapter 1, The Riddle House. The villagers of Little Hangleton still called it the Riddle House, even though it had been many years since the Riddle family had lived there. It stood on a hill overlooking the village, some of its windows boarded, tiles missing from its roof, and ivy spreading unchecked over its face. Once a fine-looking manor, and easily the largest and grandest building for miles around, the Riddle House was now damp, derelict and unoccupied. The Little Hangletons all agreed that the old house was creepy. Half a century ago, something strange and horrible had happened there, something that the older inhabitants of the village still liked to discuss when topics for gossip were scarce. The story had been picked over so many times, and had been embroidered in so many places, that nobody was quite sure what the truth was anymore. Every version of the tale, however, started in the same place. 50 years before, at daybreak on a fine summer's morning, when the Riddle House had still been well kept and impressive, and a maid had entered the drawing room to find all 3 riddles dead. The maid had run screaming down the hill into the village, and roused as many people as she could, lying there with their eyes wide open, cold as ice, still in their dinner things. The police were summoned, and the whole of Little Hangleton had seethed with shocked curiosity and ill-disguised excitement. Nobody wasted their breath pretending to feel very sad about the riddles, for they had been most unpopular. Elderly Mr. and Mrs. Riddle had been rich, snobbish and rude, and their grown-up son Tom had been even more so. All the villagers cared about was the identity of their murderer. Plainly, 3 apparently healthy people did not all drop dead of natural causes on the same night. The Hanged Man, the village pub, did a roaring trade that night. The whole village had turned out to discuss the murders. They were rewarded for leaving their firesides when the Riddle's cook arrived dramatically in their midst and announced to the suddenly silent pub that a man called Frank Bryce had just been arrested. "Frank?" cried several people. "Never!" Frank Bryce was the Riddle's gardener. He lived alone in a run-down cottage in the Riddle House grounds. Frank had come back from the war with a very stiff leg and a great dislike of crowds and loud noises, and had been working for the Riddles ever since. There was a rush to buy the cook drinks and hear more details. "Always thought he was odd," she told the eagerly listening villagers after her 4th sherry. "Unfriendly like. I'm sure I've offered him a cuppa once. I've offered it 100 times, never wanted to mix, he didn't." "Ah, now," said a woman at the bar, "he had a hard war, Frank. He likes the quiet life. There's no reason to—" "Who else had a key to the back door, then?" barked the cook. "There's been a spare key hanging in the gardener's cottage far back as I can remember. Nobody forced the door last night. No broken windows. All Frank had to do was creep up to the big house while we was all sleeping." The villagers exchanged dark looks. "I always thought he had a nasty look about him." "Right enough," grunted a man at the bar. "War turned him funny, if you ask me," said the landlord. "Told you I wouldn't like to get on the wrong side of Frank, didn't I, Dot?" said an excited woman in the corner. "Horrible temper," said Dot, nodding fervently. "I remember when he was a kid." By the following morning, hardly anyone in Little Hangleton doubted that Frank Bryce had killed the Riddles. But over in the neighbouring town of Great Hangleton, in the dark and dingy police station, Frank was stubbornly repeating again and again that he was innocent, and that the only person he had seen near the house on the day of the Riddle's death had been a teenage boy, a stranger, dark-haired and pale. Nobody else in the village had seen any such boy, and the police were quite sure that Frank had invented him. Then, just when things were looking very serious for Frank, the report on the Riddle's bodies came back and changed everything. The police had never read an odder report. A team of doctors had examined the bodies, and had concluded that none of the Riddles had been poisoned, stabbed, shot, strangled, suffocated, or, as far as they could tell, harmed at all. In fact, the report continued in a tone of unmistakable bewilderment. The Riddles all appeared to be in perfect health, apart from the fact that they were all dead. The doctors did note, as though determined to find something wrong with the bodies, that each of the Riddles had a look of terror upon his or her face. But as the frustrated police said, whoever heard of 3 people being frightened to death? As there was no proof that the Riddles had been murdered at all, the police were forced to let Frank go. The Riddles were buried in the Little Hangleton churchyard, and their graves remained objects of curiosity for a while. To everyone's surprise, and amidst a cloud of suspicion, Frank Bryce returned to his cottage in the grounds of the Riddle House. "As far as I'm concerned, he killed them, and I don't care what the police said," said Dot and the Hanged Man, "and if he had any decency, he'd leave here, knowing as how we knows he did it." But Frank did not leave. He stayed to tend the garden for the next family who lived in the Riddle House, and then the next. For neither family stayed long. Perhaps it was partly because of Frank that each new owner said there was a nasty feeling about the place, which, in the absence of inhabitants, started to fall into disrepair. The wealthy man who owned the Riddle House these days neither lived there nor put it into any use. They said in the village that he kept it for tax reasons, though nobody was very clear what these might be. The wealthy owner continued to pay Frank to do the gardening, however. Frank was nearing his 77th birthday now, very deaf, his bad legs stiffer than ever. He could be seen pottering around the flower beds in fine weather, even though the weeds were starting to creep up on him. Weeds were not the only things Frank had to contend with either. Boys from the village made a habit of throwing stones through the windows of the Riddle House. They rode their bicycles over the lawns Frank worked so hard to keep smooth. Once or twice they broke into the old house for a dare. They knew that old Frank was devoted to the house and grounds, and it amused them to see him limping across the garden, brandishing his stick and yelling croakily at them. Frank, on his part, believed the boys tormented him because they, like their parents and grandparents, thought him a murderer. So when Frank awoke one night in August and saw something very odd up at the old house, he merely assumed that the boys had gone one step further in their attempts to punish him. It was Frank's bad leg that woke him. It was paining him worse than ever in his old age. He got up and limped downstairs into the kitchen with the idea of refilling his hot water bottle to ease the stiffness in his knee. Standing at the sink filling the kettle, he looked up at the Riddle House and saw lights glimmering in its upper windows. Frank knew at once what was going on. The boys had broken into the house again, and judging by the flickering quality of the light, they had started a fire. Frank had no telephone, and in any case he had deeply mistrusted the police ever since they'd taken him in for questioning about the Riddle's deaths. He put down the kettle at once, hurried back upstairs as fast as his bad leg would allow, and was soon back in his kitchen, fully dressed and removing a rusty old key from its hook by the door. He picked up his walking stick, which was propped up against the wall, and set off into the night. The front door of the Riddle House bore no sign of being forced, and nor did any of the windows. Frank limped around to the back of the house until he reached a door almost completely hidden by ivy, took out the old key, put it into the lock, and opened the door noiselessly. He had let himself into the cavernous kitchen. Frank had not entered it for many years. Nevertheless, although it was very dark, he remembered where the door into the hall was, and he groped his way towards it, his nostrils full of the smell of decay, ears pricked for any sounds of footsteps or voices from overhead. He reached the hall, which was a little lighter owing to the large mullioned windows either side of the front door, and started to climb the stairs, blessing the dust which lay thick upon the stone, because it muffled the sound of his feet and stick. On the landing, Frank turned right, and saw at once where the intruders were. At the very end of the passage a door stood ajar, and a flickering light shone through the gap, casting a long sliver of gold across the black floor. Frank edged closer and closer, grasping his walking stick firmly. Several feet from the entrance, he was able to see a narrow slice of the room beyond. The fire, he now saw, had been lit in the grate. This surprised him. He stopped moving and listened intently, for a man's voice spoke within the room. It sounded timid and fearful. "There is a little more in the bottle, my lord, if you are still hungry." "Later," said a second voice. This too belonged to a man, but it was strangely high-pitched and cold as a sudden blast of icy wind. Something about that voice made the sparse hairs on the back of Frank's neck stand up. "Move me closer to the fire, Wormtail." Frank turned his right ear towards the door, the better to hear. There came the chink of a bottle being put down upon some hard surface, and then the dull scraping noise of a heavy chair being dragged across the floor. Frank caught a glimpse of a small man, his back to the door, pushing the chair into place. He was wearing a long black cloak, and there was a bald patch at the back of his head. Then he disappeared from sight again. "Where is Nagini?" said the cold voice. I don't know, my lord," said the first voice nervously. "She set out to explore the house, I think." "You will milk her before we retire, Wormtail," said the second voice. "I will need feeding in the night. The journey has tired me greatly." Brow furrowed, Frank inclined his good ear still closer to the door, listening very hard. There was a pause, and then the man called Wormtail spoke again. "My lord, may I ask how long we're going to stay here?" "A week," said the cold voice. "Perhaps longer. The place is moderately comfortable, and the plan cannot proceed yet. It would be foolish to act before the Quidditch World Cup is over." Frank inserted a gnarled finger into his ear and rotated it. Owing, no doubt, to a build-up of earwax, he had heard the word Quidditch, which was not a word at all. The Quidditch World Cup, my lord, said Wormtail. Frank dug his finger still more vigorously into his ear. Forgive me, but I do not understand. Why should we wait until the World Cup is over? Because, fool, at this very moment wizards are pouring into the country from all over the world, and every meddler from the Ministry of Magic will be on duty, on the watch for signs of unusual activity, checking and double-checking identities. They will be obsessed with security, lest the muggles notice anything. So we wait. Frank stopped trying to clear his ear out. He had distinctly heard the words Ministry of Magic, wizards and muggles. Plainly, each of these expressions meant something secret, and Frank could think of only two sorts of people who would speak in code: spies and criminals. Frank tightened his hold on his walking stick once more, and listened more closely still. Your lordship is still determined, then? Wormtail said quietly. Certainly I am determined, Wormtail. There was a note of menace in the cold voice now. A slight pause followed, and then Wormtail spoke, the words tumbling from him in a rush, as though he was forcing himself to say this before he lost his nerve. It could be done without Harry Potter, my lord. Another pause, more protracted, and then, without Harry Potter, breathed the second voice softly. I see. My lord, I do not say this out of concern for the boy, said Wormtail, his voice rising squeakily. The boy is nothing to me, nothing at all. It is merely that if we were to use another witch or wizard, any wizard, the thing could be done so much more quickly. If you allowed me to leave you for a short while, you know that I can disguise myself most effectively. I could be back here in as little as 2 days with a suitable person. I could use another wizard, said the second voice softly. That is true. My lord, it makes sense, said Wormtail, sounding thoroughly relieved now. Laying hands on Harry Potter would be so difficult. He is so well protected. And so you volunteer to go and fetch me a substitute. I wonder, perhaps the task of nursing me has become wearisome for you. Wormtail, could this suggestion of abandoning the plan be nothing more than an attempt to desert me? My lord, I have no wish to leave you, none at all. Do not lie to me, hissed the second voice. I can always tell, Wormtail. You are regretting that you ever returned to me. I revolt you. I see you flinch when you look at me, feel you shudder when you touch me. No, my devotion to your lordship. Your devotion is nothing more than cowardice. You would not be here if you had anywhere else to go. How am I to survive without you, when I need feeding every few hours? Who is to milk Nagini? But you seem so much stronger, my lord. Liar, breathed the second voice. I am no stronger, and a few days alone will be enough to rob me of the little health I have regained under your clumsy care. Silence. Wormtail, who had been spluttering incoherently, fell silent at once. For a few seconds Frank could hear nothing but the fire crackling. Then the second man spoke once again, in a whisper that was almost a hiss. I have my reasons for using the boy, as I have already explained to you, and I will use no other. I have waited 13 years. A few more months will make no difference. As for the protection surrounding the boy, I believe my plan will be effective. All that is needed is a little courage from you, Wormtail. Courage you will find, unless you wish to feel the full extent of Lord Voldemort's wrath. My lord, I must speak, said Wormtail, panic in his voice now. All through your journey, our journey, I have gone over the plan in my head, my lord. Bertha Jenkins' disappearance will not go unnoticed for long, and if we proceed, I curse. If, whispered the second voice, if you follow the plan, Wormtail, the Ministry need never know that anyone else has disappeared. You will do it quietly and without fuss. I only wish that I could do it myself, but in my present condition... Come, Wormtail, one more obstacle removed, and our path to Harry Potter is clear. I am not asking you to do it alone. By that time, my faithful servant will have rejoined us. I am a faithful servant, said Wormtail, the merest trace of sullenness in his voice. Wormtail, I need somebody with brains, somebody whose loyalty has never wavered, and you, unfortunately, fulfill neither requirement. I found you, said Wormtail, and there was definitely a sulky edge to his voice now. I was the one who found you. I brought you Bertha Jenkins. Bertha Jorkins. That is true, said the second man, sounding amused. A stroke of brilliance I would not have thought possible from you, Wormtail, though, if truth be told, you were not aware how useful she would be when you caught her, were you? I thought she might be useful, my lord. Liar, said the second voice again, the cruel amusement more pronounced than ever. However, I do not deny that her information was invaluable. Without it, I could never have formed our plan, and for that you will have your reward, Wormtail. It will allow you to perform an essential task for me, one that many of my followers will give their right hands to perform. Really, my lord? What? Wormtail sounded terrified again. Ah, Wormtail, you don't want me to spoil the surprise. Your part will come at the very end, but I promise you, you will have the honour of being just as useful as Bertha Jorkins. You, Wormtail's voice sounded suddenly hoarse, as though his mouth had gone very dry. You are going to kill me too? Wormtail, Wormtail, said the cold voice silkily. Why would I kill you? I killed Bertha because I had to. She was fit for nothing after my questioning, quite useless. In any case, awkward questions would have been asked if she had gone back to the ministry, and then with the news that she had met you on her holidays. Wizards, who are supposed to be dead, would do well not to run into Ministry of Magic witches at wayside inns. Wormtail muttered something so quietly that Frank could not hear it, but it made the second man laugh, an entirely mirthless laugh, cold as his speech. We could have modified her memory, but memory charms can be broken by a powerful wizard, as I proved when I questioned her. It would be an insult to her memory not to use the information I extracted from her, Wormtail. Out in the corridor, Frank suddenly became aware that the hand gripping his walking stick was slippery with sweat. The man with the cold voice had killed a woman. He was talking about it without any kind of remorse, with amusement. He was dangerous, a madman, and he was planning more murders. This boy, Harry Potter, whoever he was in danger. Frank knew what he must do. Now, if ever, was the time to go to the police. He would creep out of the house and head straight for the telephone box in the village. But the cold voice was speaking again, and Frank remained where he was, frozen to the spot, listening with all his might. One more curse. My faithful servant at Hogwarts, Harry Potter, is as good as mine, Wormtail. It is decided. There will be no more argument. But quiet. I think I hear Nagini. And the second man's voice changed. He started making noises, such as Frank had never heard before. He was hissing and spitting, without drawing breath. Frank thought he must be having some sort of fit or seizure. And then Frank heard movement behind him in the dark passageway. He turned to look behind him and found himself paralysed with fright. Something was slithering towards him along the dark corridor floor, and as it drew nearer to the sliver of firelight, he realised with a thrill of terror that it was a gigantic snake, at least 12 feet long. Horrified, transfixed, Frank stared at it as its undulating body cut a wide, curving track through the thick dust on the floor, coming closer and closer. What was he to do? The only means of escape was into the room where two men sat plotting murder, yet he stayed where he was. If he stayed where he was, the snake would surely kill him. But before he had made his decision, the snake was level with him. And then, incredibly, miraculously, it was passing. It was following the spitting, hissing noises made by the cold voice behind the door, and in seconds the tip of its diamond-patterned tail had vanished through the gap. There was sweat on Frank's forehead now, and the hand on the walking stick was trembling. Inside the room, the cold voice was continuing to hiss, and Frank was visited by a strange idea, an impossible idea. This man could talk to snakes. Frank didn't understand what was going on. He wanted more than anything to be back in his bed with his hot water bottle. The problem was that his legs didn't seem to want to move. As he stood there shaking and trying to master himself, the cold voice switched abruptly to English again. Nagini has interesting news, Wormtail, it said. Indeed, my lord, said Wormtail. Indeed, yes, said the voice. According to Nagini, there is an old muggle standing right outside this room, listening to every word we say. Frank didn't have a chance to hide himself. There were footsteps, and then the door of the room was flung wide open. A short, balding man with greying hair, a pointed nose, and small, watery eyes stood before Frank, a mixture of fear and alarm on his face. Invite him inside, Wormtail. Where are your manners? The cold voice was coming from the ancient armchair before the fire, but Frank couldn't see the speaker. The snake, on the other hand, was curled up on the rotting hearthrug, like some horrible travesty of a pet dog. Wormtail beckoned Frank into the room. Though still deeply shaken, Frank took a firmer grip upon his walking stick and limped over the threshold. The fire was the only source of light in the room. It was casting long, spidery shadows over the walls. Frank stared at the back of the armchair, and then inside it seemed to be even smaller than his servant. The man inside it seemed to be even smaller than his servant, for Frank couldn't even see the back of his head. "You heard everything, Muggle?" said the cold voice. What's that you're calling me?" said Frank defiantly, for now that he was inside the room, now that the time had come for some sort of action, he felt braver. It had always been so in the war. "I am calling you a Muggle," said the voice coolly. "It means that you are not a wizard." I don't know what you mean by wizard," said Frank, his voice growing steadier. "All I know is I've heard enough to interest the police tonight. I have. You've done murder, and you're planning more, and I'll tell you this too," he added on a sudden inspiration. "My wife knows I'm up here, and if I don't come back—" "You have no wife," said the cold voice very quietly. "Nobody knows you are here. You told nobody that you were coming. Do not lie to Lord Voldemort, Muggle, for he knows. He always knows." "Is that right?" said Frank roughly. "Lord, is it? Well, I don't think much of your manners, my lord. Turn round and face me like a man, why don't you?" "But I am not a man, Muggle," said the cold voice, barely audible now over the crackling of the flames. "I am much, much more than a man. However, why not? I will face you. Wormtail, come turn my chair around." The servant gave a whimper. "You heard me, Wormtail." Slowly, with his face screwed up, as though he would rather have done anything than approach his master and the hearthrug where the snake lay, the small man walked forwards and began to turn the chair. The snake lifted its ugly triangular head and hissed slightly as the legs of the chair snagged on its rug. And then the chair was facing Frank, and he saw what was sitting in it. His walking stick fell to the floor with a clatter. He opened his mouth and let out a scream. He was screaming so loudly that he never heard the words the thing in the chair spoke. As it raised a wand, there was a flash of green light, a rushing sound, and Frank Bryce crumpled. He was dead before he hit the floor. 200 miles away, the boy called Harry Potter woke with a start. Chapter 2. The Scar. Harry lay flat on his back, breathing hard as though he had been running. He had awoken from a vivid dream, with his hands pressed over his face. The old scar on his forehead, which was shaped like a bolt of lightning, was burning beneath his fingers, as though someone had just pressed a white-hot wire to his skin. He sat up, one hand still on his scar, the other reaching out in the darkness for his glasses, which were on the bedside table. He put them on, and his bedroom came into clearer focus, lit by a faint, misty orange light that was filtering through the curtains from the street lamp outside the window. Harry ran his fingers over the scar again. It was still painful. He turned on the lamp beside him, scrambled out of bed, crossed the room, opened his wardrobe and peered into the mirror on the inside of the door. A skinny boy of 14 looked back at him, his bright green eyes puzzled under his untidy black hair. He examined the lightning bolt scar of his reflection more closely. It looked normal, but it was still stinging. Harry tried to recall what he had been dreaming about before he had awoken. It had seemed so real. There had been 2 people he knew, and one he didn't. He concentrated hard, frowning, trying to remember. The dim picture of a darkened room came to him. There had been a snake on a hearthrug, a small man called Peter, nicknamed Wormtail, and a cold, high voice, the voice of Lord Voldemort. Harry felt as though an ice cube had slipped down into his stomach at the very thought. He closed his eyes tightly and tried to remember what Voldemort had looked like, but it was impossible. All Harry knew was that at that moment, the moment when Voldemort's chair had swung around, and he, Harry, had seen what was sitting in it, he had felt a spasm of horror which had awoken him, or had that been the pain in his scar? And who had the old man been? For there had definitely been an old man. Harry had watched him fall to the ground. It was all becoming confused. Harry put his face into his hands, blocking out his bedroom, trying to hold on to the picture of that dimly lit room, but it was like trying to keep water in his cupped hands. The details were now trickling away as fast as he tried to hold on to them. Voldemort and Wormtail had been talking about someone they had killed, though Harry could not remember the name, and they had been plotting to kill someone else. Him. Harry took his face out of his hands, opened his eyes and stared around his bedroom as though expecting to see something unusual there. As it happened, there were an extraordinary number of unusual things in the room. A large wooden trunk stood open at the foot of his bed, revealing a cauldron, broomstick, black robes and assorted spellbooks. Rolls of parchment littered the part of his desk that was not taken up by the large empty cage in which his snowy owl Hedwig usually perched. On the floor beside his bed, a book lay open. He had been reading it before he fell asleep the previous night. The pictures in the book were all moving. Men in bright orange robes were zooming in and out of sight on broomsticks, throwing a red ball to each other. Harry walked over to this book, picked it up and watched one of the wizards score a spectacular goal by putting the ball through a 50-foot high hoop. Then he snapped the book shut. Even Quidditch, in Harry's opinion, the best sport in the world, couldn't distract him at that moment. He placed Flying with the Cannons on his bedside table, crossed to the window and drew back the curtains to survey the street below. Privet Drive looked exactly as a respectable suburban street would be expected to look in the early hours of Saturday morning. All the curtains were closed. As far as Harry could see through the darkness, there wasn't even a living creature in sight, not even a cat. And yet, Harry went restlessly back to his bed and sat down on it, running a finger over his scar again. It wasn't the pain that bothered him. Harry was no stranger to pain and injury. He had lost all the bones from his right arm once, and had them painfully regrown in a night. The same arm had been pierced by a venomous, foot-long fang not long afterwards. Only last year Harry had fallen 50 feet from an airborne broomstick. He was used to bizarre accidents and injuries. They were unavoidable if you attended Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry and had a knack for attracting a lot of trouble. No, the thing that was bothering Harry was that the last time his scar had hurt him, it had been because Voldemort had been close by. But Voldemort couldn't be here now. The idea of Voldemort lurking in Privet Drive was absurd, impossible. Harry listened closely to the silence around him. Was he half expecting to hear the creak of a stair, on the swish of a cloak? And then he jumped slightly as he heard his cousin Dudley give a tremendous grunting snore from the next room. Harry shook himself mentally. He was being stupid. There was no one in the house with him except Uncle Vernon, Aunt Petunia and Dudley, and they were plainly still asleep, their dreams untroubled and painless. Asleep was the way Harry liked the Dursleys best. It wasn't as though they were ever any help to him awake. Uncle Vernon, Aunt Petunia and Dudley were Harry's only living relatives. They were muggles, non-magic people, who hated and despised magic in any form, which meant that Harry was about as welcome in their house as dry rot. They had explained away Harry's long absences at Hogwarts over the last 3 years by telling everyone that he went to St. Brutus's Secure Centre for Incurably Criminal Boys. They knew perfectly well that, as an underage wizard, Harry wasn't allowed to use magic outside Hogwarts, but were still apt to blame him for anything that went wrong about the house. Harry had never been able to confide in them or tell them anything about his life in the wizarding world. The very idea of going to them when they awoke and telling them about his scar hurting him and about his worries about Voldemort was laughable. And yet it was because of Voldemort that Harry had come to live with the Dursleys in the first place. If it hadn't been for Voldemort, Harry would not have had the lightning scar on his forehead. If it hadn't been for Voldemort, Harry would still have had parents. Harry had been a year old the night that Voldemort, the most powerful dark wizard for a century, a wizard who had been gaining power steadily for 11 years, arrived at his house and killed his father and mother. Voldemort had then turned his wand on Harry. He had performed the curse that had disposed of many full-grown witches and wizards in his steady rise to power, and incredibly, it had not worked. Instead of killing the small boy, the curse had rebounded upon Voldemort. Harry had survived with nothing but a lightning-shaped cut on his forehead, and Voldemort had been reduced to something barely alive. His powers gone, his life almost extinguished. Voldemort had fled. The terror in which the secret community of witches and wizards had lived for so long had lifted. Voldemort's followers had disbanded, and Harry Potter had become famous. It had been enough of a shock for Harry to discover on his 11th birthday that he was a wizard. It had been even more disconcerting to find out that everyone in the hidden wizarding world knew his name. Harry had arrived at Hogwarts to find that heads turned and whispers followed him wherever he went. But he was used to it now. At the end of this summer, he would be starting his 4th year at Hogwarts, and he was already counting the days until he would be back at the castle again. But there was still a fortnight to go before he went back to school. He looked hopelessly around his room again, and his eye paused on the birthday cards his 2 best friends had sent him at the end of July. What would they say if he wrote to them and told them about his scar hurting? At once, Hermione Granger's voice filled his head, shrill and panicky. "Your scar hurt, Harry? That's really serious. Write to Professor Dumbledore, and I'll go and check. Common magical ailments and afflictions. Maybe there's something in there about curse scars." Yes, that would be Hermione's advice. Go straight to the headmaster of Hogwarts, and in the meantime, consult a book. Harry stared out of the window in the inky blue-black sky. He doubted very much whether a book could help him now. As far as he knew, he was the only living person to ever survive a curse like Voldemort's. It was highly unlikely, therefore, that he would find his symptoms listed in common magical ailments and afflictions. As for informing the headmaster, Harry had no idea where Dumbledore went during the summer holidays. He amused himself for a moment, picturing Dumbledore with his long silver beard, full-length wizard's robes and pointed hat, stretched out on a beach somewhere, rubbing suntan lotion into his long, crooked nose. Wherever Dumbledore was, though, Harry was sure that Hedwig would be able to find him. Harry's owl had never yet failed to deliver a letter to anyone, even without an address. But what would he write? Dear Professor Dumbledore, sorry to bother you, but my scar hurt this morning. Yours sincerely, Harry Potter. Even inside his head the words sounded stupid, and so he tried to imagine his other best friend, Ron Weasley's reaction, and in a moment, Ron's long-nosed, freckled face seemed to swim before Harry, wearing a bemused expression. Your scar hurt? But you know who can't be near you now, can he? I mean, you'd know, wouldn't you? He'd be trying to do you in again, wouldn't he? I don't know, Harry. Maybe cursed scars always twinge a bit. I'll ask Dad. Mr. Weasley was a fully qualified wizard who worked in the misuse of Muggle artefacts office at the Ministry of Magic, but he didn't have any particular expertise in the matter of curses, as far as Harry knew. In any case, Harry didn't like the idea of the whole Weasley family knowing that he, Harry, was getting jumpy about a few moments' pain. Mrs. Weasley would fuss worse than Hermione, and Fred and George, Ron's 16-year-old twin brothers, might think Harry was losing his nerve. The Weasleys were Harry's favourite family in the world. He was hoping that they might invite him to stay any time now. Ron had mentioned something about the Quidditch World Cup, and somehow didn't want his visit punctuated with anxious inquiries about his scar. Harry kneaded his forehead with his knuckles. What he really wanted, and it felt almost shameful to admit it to himself, was someone like a parent, an adult wizard whose advice he could ask without feeling stupid, someone who cared about him, who had experience of dark magic. And then the solution came to him. It was so simple and so obvious that he couldn't believe it had taken so long. Sirius. Harry leapt up from the bed, hurried across the room and sat down at his desk. He pulled a piece of parchment towards him, loaded his eagle feather quill with ink, wrote, Dear Sirius, and then paused, wondering how best to phrase his problem, and still marvelling at the fact that he hadn't thought of Sirius straight away. But then, perhaps, it wasn't so surprising. After all, he had only found out that Sirius was his godfather 2 months ago. There was a simple reason for Sirius' complete absence from Harry's life until then. Sirius had been in Azkaban, the terrifying wizard Gale, guarded by creatures called Dementors, sightless, soul-sucking fiends who had come to search for Sirius at Hogwarts when he had escaped. Yet Sirius had been innocent. The murders for which he had been convicted had been committed by Wormtail, Voldemort's supporter, whom nearly everybody now believed dead. Harry, Ron and Hermione knew otherwise. However, they had come face to face with Wormtail the previous year, though only Professor Dumbledore had believed their story. For one glorious hour, Harry had believed that he was leaving the Dursleys at last, because Sirius had offered him a home once his name had been cleared, but the chance had been snatched away from him. Wormtail had escaped before they could take him to the Ministry of Magic, and Sirius had had to flee for his life. Harry had helped him escape on the back of a hippogriff called Buckbeak, and since then Sirius had been on the run. The home Harry might have had, if Wormtail had not escaped, had been haunting him all summer. It had been doubly hard to return to the Dursleys knowing that he had so nearly escaped them forever. Nevertheless, Sirius had been of some help for Harry. Even if he couldn't be with him, it was due to Sirius that Harry now had all his school things in his bedroom with him. The Dursleys had never allowed this before. Their general wish of keeping Harry as miserable as possible, coupled with their fear of his powers, had led them to lock his school trunk in the cupboard under the stairs every summer prior to this. But their attitude had changed. Since they had found out that Harry had a dangerous murderer for a godfather, Harry had conveniently forgotten to tell them that Sirius was innocent. Harry had received 2 letters from Sirius since he had been back at Privet Drive. Both had been delivered, not by owls, as was usual with wizards, but by large, brightly coloured tropical birds. Hedwig had not approved of these flashy intruders. She had been most reluctant to allow them to drink from her water tray before flying off again. Harry, on the other hand, had liked them. They put him in a mind of palm trees and white sand, and he hoped that wherever Sirius was, Sirius never said, in case the letters were intercepted, he was enjoying himself. Somehow Harry found it hard to imagine Dementors surviving for long in bright sunlight. Perhaps that was why Sirius had gone south. Sirius letters, which were now hidden beneath the highly useful loose floorboard under Harry's bed, sounded cheerful, and in both of them he had reminded Harry to call on him if ever Harry needed to. Well, he needed to now. All right. Harry's lamp seemed to grow dimmer as the cold grey light that precedes a sunrise slowly crept into the room. Finally, when the sun had risen, when his bedroom walls had turned gold, and when sounds of movement could be heard from Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia's room, Harry cleared his desk of crumpled pieces of parchment and reread his finished letter. Dear Sirius, thanks for your last letter, and that bird was enormous. It could hardly yet fit through my window. Things are the same as usual here. Dudley's diet isn't going too well. My aunt found him smuggling doughnuts into his room yesterday. They told him they'd have to cut his pocket money if he keeps doing it. So he got really angry and chucked his PlayStation out of the window. That's the sort of computer thing that you can play games on. But stupid, really. Now he hasn't even got Mega Mutilation, Port 3, to take his mind off things. I'm okay, mainly because the Dursleys are terrified you might turn up and turn them all into bats if I ask you to. A weird thing happened this morning, though. My scar hurt again. Last time that happened, it was because Voldemort was at Hogwarts, but I don't reckon he can be anywhere near me now, can he? Do you know if curse scars sometimes hurt years afterwards? I'll send this with Hedwig when he gets back. She's off hunting at this moment. Say hello to Buckbeak for me, Harry. Yes, thought Harry, that looked all right. There was no point putting in the dream. He didn't want it to look as though he was too worried. He folded the parchment up and laid it aside the desk, ready for when Hedwig returned. Then he got to his feet, stretched, and opened his wardrobe once more. Without glancing at his reflection, he started to get dressed before going down to breakfast. Chapter 3. The Invitation. By the time Harry arrived in the kitchen, the three Dursleys were already seated around the table. None of them looked up as he entered or sat down. Uncle Vernon's large red face was hidden behind the morning's Daily Mail, and Aunt Petunia was cutting a grapefruit into quarters, her lips pursed over her horse-like teeth. Dudley looked furious and sulky, and somehow seemed to be taking up even more space than usual. This was saying something, as he always took up an entire side of the square table by himself. When Aunt Petunia put a quarter of unsweetened grapefruit onto Dudley's plate with a tremulous, "There you are, Diddy darling," Dudley glowered at her. His life had taken a most unpleasant turn since he had come home for the summer with his end-of-year report. Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia had managed to find excuses for his bad marks as usual. Aunt Petunia always insisted that Dudley was a very gifted boy whose teachers didn't understand him, while Uncle Vernon maintained that he didn't want some swotty little Nancy boy for a son anyway. They also skated over the accusations of bullying and the report. "He's a boisterous little boy, but he wouldn't hurt a fly," said Aunt Petunia tearfully. However, at the bottom of the report there were a few well-chosen comments from the school nurse, which not even Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia could explain away. No matter how much Aunt Petunia wailed that Dudley was big-boned, and that his poundage was really puppy fat, and that he was a growing boy who needed plenty of food, the fact remained that the school outfitters didn't stock knickerbockers big enough for him any more. The school nurse had seen what Aunt Petunia's eyes, so sharp when it came to spotting fingerprints on her gleaming walls, and in observing the comings and goings of neighbours, simply refused to see. That far from needing extra nourishment, Dudley had reached roughly the size and weight of a young killer whale. So, after many tantrums, after arguments that shook Harry's bedroom floor, and many tears from Aunt Petunia, the new regime had begun. The diet sheet that had been sent by the smelting school nurse had been taped to the fridge, which had been emptied of all Dudley's favourite things, fizzy drinks and cakes, chocolate bars and burgers, and filled instead with fruit and vegetables, and the sorts of things that Uncle Vernon called rabbit food. To make Dudley feel better about it all, Aunt Petunia had insisted that the whole family follow the diet too. She now passed a grapefruit quarter to Harry. He noticed that it was a lot smaller than Dudley's. Aunt Petunia seemed to feel that the best way to keep up Dudley's morale was to make sure that he did at least get more to eat than Harry. But Aunt Petunia didn't know what was hidden under the loose floorboard upstairs. She had no idea that Harry was not following the diet at all. The moment he had got wind of the fact that he was expected to survive the summer on carrot sticks, Harry had sent Hedwig to his friends with pleas for help, and they had risen to the occasion magnificently. Hedwig had returned from Hermione's house with a large box stuffed full of sugar-free snacks. Hermione's parents were dentists. Hagrid, the Hogwarts gamekeeper, had obliged with a sack full of his own homemade rock cakes. Harry hadn't touched those. He had had too much experience of Hagrid's cooking. Mrs. Weasley, however, hadn't sent the family owl, Errol, with an enormous fruitcake. Had sent the family owl, Errol, with an enormous fruitcake and assorted pasties. Poor Errol, who was elderly and feeble, had needed a full 5 days to recover from the journey, and then on Harry's birthday, which the Dursleys had completely ignored, he had received 4 superb birthday cakes, one each from Ron, Hermione, Hagrid and Sirius. Harry still had 2 of them left, and so, looking forward to a real breakfast when he got back upstairs, he started eating his grapefruit without complaint. Uncle Vernon laid aside his paper with a deep sniff of disapproval and looked down at his own grapefruit quarter. "Is this it?" he said grumpily to Aunt Petunia. Aunt Petunia gave him a severe look and then nodded pointedly at Dudley, who had already finished his own grapefruit quarter and was eyeing Harry's with a very sour look in his piggy little eyes. Uncle Vernon gave a great sigh, which ruffled his large bushy moustache, and picked up his spoon. The doorbell rang. Uncle Vernon heaved himself out of his chair and set off down the hall. Quick as a flash, while his mother was occupied with the kettle, Dudley stole the rest of Uncle Vernon's grapefruit. Harry heard talking at the door and someone laughing, and Uncle Vernon answering curtly. Then the front door closed, and the sound of ripping paper came from the hall. Aunt Petunia set the teapot down on the table and looked curiously around to see where Uncle Vernon had got to. She didn't have to wait long to find out. After about a minute, he was back. He looked livid. "You!" he barked at Harry. "In the living room, now!" Bewildered, wondering what on earth he was supposed to have done this time, Harry got up and followed Uncle Vernon out of the kitchen and into the next room. Uncle Vernon closed the door sharply behind both of them. "So," he said, marching over to the fireplace and turning to face Harry as though he was about to pronounce him under arrest. "So?" Harry would have dearly loved to have said, "So what?" But he didn't feel that Uncle Vernon's temper should be tested this early in the morning, especially when it was already under severe strain from lack of food. He therefore settled for looking politely puzzled. "This just arrived," said Uncle Vernon. He brandished a piece of purple writing paper at Harry. "A letter. About you." Harry's confusion increased. Who could be writing to Uncle Vernon about him? Who did he know who sent letters by the postman? Uncle Vernon glared at Harry and then looked down at the letter and began to read aloud. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Dursley, we have never been introduced, but I am sure you have heard a great deal from Harry about my son Ron. As Harry might have told you, the final of the Quidditch World Cup takes place next Monday night, and my husband and Arthur has just managed to get some tickets through his connections at the Department of Magical Games and Sports. I do hope you will allow us to take Harry to the match, as this really is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Britain hasn't hosted the Cup for 30 years, and tickets are extremely hard to come by. We would, of course, be glad to have Harry to stay for the remainder of the summer holidays and to see him safely onto the train back to school. It would be best for Harry to send us your answer as quickly as possible in the normal way, because the Muggle postman has never delivered to our house, and I am not sure he even knows where it is. Hoping to see Harry soon. Yours sincerely, Molly Weasley. P.S. I do hope we've put enough stamps on." Uncle Vernon finished reading, put his hand back into his breast pocket and drew out something else. "Look at this," he growled. He held up the envelope in which Mrs. Weasley's letter had come, and Harry had to fight down a laugh. Every bit of it was covered in stamps except for a square inch on the front, into which Mrs. Weasley had squeezed the Dursleys' address in minute writing. "She did put enough stamps on then," said Harry, trying to sound as though Mrs. Weasley's was a mistake anyone could make. His uncle's eyes flashed. "The postman noticed," he said, through gritted teeth. "Very interested to know where this letter came from," he said. "That's why he rang the doorbell. Seemed to think it was funny." Harry didn't say anything. Other people might not understand why Uncle Vernon was making a fuss about too many stamps, but Harry had lived with the Dursleys too long not to know how touchy they were about anything even slightly out of the ordinary. Their worst fear was that anyone would find out that they were connected, however distantly, with people like Mrs. Weasley. Uncle Vernon was still glaring at Harry, who tried to keep his expression neutral. If he didn't do or say anything stupid, he might just be in for the treat of a lifetime. He waited for Uncle Vernon to say something, but he merely continued to glare. Harry decided to break the silence. "So, can I go then?" he asked. A slight spasm crossed Uncle Vernon's large purple face. The moustache bristled. Harry thought he knew what was going on behind the moustache. A furious battle as two of Uncle Vernon's most fundamental instincts came into conflict. Allowing Harry to go would make Harry happy, something Uncle Vernon had struggled against for 13 years. On the other hand, allowing Harry to disappear to the Weasleys for the rest of the summer would get rid of him 2 weeks earlier than anyone could have hoped, and Uncle Vernon hated having Harry in the house. To give himself thinking time, it seemed, he looked down at Mrs. Weasley's letter again. "Who is this woman?" he said, staring at the signature with distaste. "You've seen her," said Harry. "She's my friend Ron's mother. She was meeting him off the school train at the end of last term." He had almost said Hogwarts Express, and that was a sure way to get his uncle's temper up. Nobody ever mentioned the name of Harry's school aloud in the Dursley household. Uncle Vernon screwed up his enormous face, as though trying to remember something very unpleasant. "Dumpy sort of woman," he growled finally. "Load of children with red hair?" Harry frowned. He thought it was a bit rich of Uncle Vernon to call anyone dumpy, when his own son Dudley had finally achieved what he'd been threatening to do since the age of 3 and become wider than he was tall. Uncle Vernon was pursing the letter again and perusing it. "Quidditch," he muttered under his breath. "Quidditch? What is this rubbish?" Harry felt a second stab of annoyance. "It's a sport," he said shortly. "Played on a broom." All right, said Uncle Vernon loudly. Harry saw with some satisfaction that his uncle looked vaguely panicky. Apparently his nerves wouldn't stand the sound of the word broomsticks in his living room. He took refuge in perusing the letter again. Harry saw his lips form the words, "Send us your answer in the normal way." He scowled. "What does she mean, the normal way?" he spat. "Normal for us," said Harry, and before his uncle could stop him, he added, "You know, owl post. That's what's normal for wizards." Uncle Vernon looked as outraged as if Harry had just uttered a disgusting swear word. Shaking with anger, he shot a nervy look through the window, as though expecting to see some of the neighbours with their ears pressed against the glass. "How many times do I have to tell you not to mention that unnaturalness under my roof?" he hissed, his face now a rich plum colour. "You stand there, in the clothes Petunia and I have put on your ungrateful back." "Only after Dudley finished with them," said Harry coldly. And indeed he was dressed in a sweatshirt so large for him that he had to roll back the sleeves 5 times so as to be able to use his hands, and which fell past the knees of his extremely baggy jeans. "I will not be spoken to like that," said Uncle Vernon, trembling with rage. But Harry wasn't going to stand for this. Gone were the days when he had been forced to take every single one of the Dursley stupid rules. He wasn't following Dudley's diet, and he wasn't going to let Uncle Vernon stop him going to the Quidditch World Cup, not if he could help it. Harry took a deep, steadying breath and then said, "OK, I can't see the World Cup. Can I go now then? Only I've got a letter to Sirius I want to finish. You know, my godfather." He had done it. He had said the magic words. Now he watched the purple recede blotchily from Uncle Vernon's face, making it look like badly mixed blackcurrant ice cream. You're writing to him, are you?" said Uncle Vernon, in a would-be calm voice. But Harry had seen the pupils of his tiny eyes contract with sudden fear. "Well, yeah," said Harry casually. "It's been a while since he heard from me, and, you know, if he doesn't, he might start thinking something's wrong." He stopped there to enjoy the effect of these words. He could almost see the cogs working under Uncle Vernon's thick, dark, neatly parted hair. If he tried to stop Harry writing to Sirius, Sirius would think Harry was being mistreated. If he told Harry he couldn't go to the Quidditch World Cup, Harry would write and tell Sirius, who would know he was being mistreated. There was only one thing for Uncle Vernon to do. Harry could see the conclusion forming in his mind, as though the great moustached face was transparent. Harry tried not to smile, to keep his own face as blank as possible, and then, "Well, all right then. You can go to this ruddy, this stupid, this World Cup thing. You write and tell these Weasleys that they'll pick you up. Mind, I haven't got time to be dropping you off all over the country, and you can spend the rest of the summer there. And you can tell your godfather, tell him you're going." "OK then," said Harry brightly. He turned and walked towards the living room door, fighting the urge to jump into the air and whoop. He was going. He was going to the Weasleys. He was going to watch the Quidditch World Cup. Outside in the hall, he nearly ran into Dudley, who had been lurking behind the door, clearly hoping to overhear Harry being told off. He looked shocked to see the broad grin on Harry's face. "That was an excellent breakfast, wasn't it?" said Harry. "I feel really full, don't you?" Laughing at the astonished look on Dudley's face, Harry took the stairs, 3 at a time, and hurled himself back into his bedroom. The first thing he saw was that Hedwig was back. She was sitting in her cage, staring at Harry with her enormous amber eyes and clicking her beak with the way that meant she was annoyed about something. Exactly what was annoying her became apparent almost at once. "Ouch!" said Harry. What appeared to be a small grey, feathery tennis ball had just collided with the side of Harry's head. Harry massaged his head furiously, looking up to see what had hit him, and saw a minute owl small enough to fit into the palm of his hand, whizzing excitedly around the room like a loose firework. Harry then realised that the owl had dropped a letter at his feet. Harry bent down, recognising Ron's handwriting, then tore open the envelope. Inside was a hastily scribbled note. "Harry, Dad got the tickets. Ireland versus Bulgaria. Monday night. Mum's writing to the Muggles to ask you to stay. They might already have had the letter. I don't know how fast Muggle post is. Thought I'd send this with Pig anyway." Harry stared at the word pig, then looked up at the tiny owl now zooming around the lampshade on the ceiling. He had never seen anything that looked less like a pig. Maybe he couldn't read Ron's writing. He went back to the letter. "We're coming for you whether the Muggles like it or not. You can't miss the World Cup. Only Mum and Dad reckon it's better if we pretend to ask their permission first. If they say yes, send Pig back with your answer pronto, and we'll come and get you at 5 o'clock on Sunday. If they say no, send Pig back pronto, and we'll come and get you at 5 o'clock on Sunday anyway. Hermione's arriving this afternoon. Percy started work, the Department of International Magical Cooperation. Don't mention anything about abroad while you're here, unless you want the pants board off you. See you soon, Ron." "Calm down," Harry said, as the small owl flew over his head, twittering madly, with what Harry could only assume was pride in having delivered the letter to the right person. "Come here. I need you to take my answer back." The owl fluttered down on top of Hedwig's cage. Hedwig looked coldly up at it, though daring it to try and come any closer. Harry seized his eagle feather quill once more, grabbed a fresh piece of parchment and wrote, "Ron, it's all okay. The Muggles say I can come. See you 5 o'clock tomorrow. Can't wait, Harry." He folded this note up, very small, and with immense difficulty tied it to the tiny owl's leg as it hopped on the spot with excitement. The moment the note was secure, the owl was off again. It zoomed out of the window and out of sight. Harry turned to Hedwig. "Feeling up for a long journey?" he asked her. Hedwig hooted in a dignified sort of way. "Can you take this to Sirius for me?" he said, picking up his letter. "Hang on, I just want to finish it." He unfolded the parchment again and hastily added a postscript. "If you want to contact me, I'll be at my friend Ron Weasley's for the rest of the summer. His dad's got us tickets for the Quidditch World Cup." The letter finished. He tied it to Hedwig's leg. She kept unusually still, as though determined to show him how a real post owl should behave. I'll be at Ron's when you get back, all right?" Harry told her. She nipped his finger affectionately, then with a soft swooshing noise spread her enormous wings and soared out of the open window. Harry watched her out of sight, then crawled under his bed, wrenched up the loose floorboard and pulled out a large chunk of birthday cake. He sat there on the floor eating it, savouring the happiness that was flooding through him. He had cake, and Dudley had nothing but grapefruit. It was a bright summer's day. He would be leaving Privet Drive tomorrow. His scar felt perfectly normal again, and he was going to watch the Quidditch World Cup. It was hard just now to feel worried about anything, even Lord Voldemort. Chapter 4. Back to the Burrow. By 12 o'clock next day, Harry's trunk was packed with his school things and all his most prized possessions. The invisibility cloak he had inherited from his father, the broomstick he had got from Sirius, the enchanted map of Hogwarts he had been given by Fred and George Weasley last year. He had emptied his hiding place under the loose floorboard of all food, double-checked every nook and cranny of his bedroom for forgotten spellbooks or quills, and taken down the chart on the wall, counting the days down to September the 1st, on which he liked to cross off the days remaining until he returned to Hogwarts. The atmosphere inside number 4 Privet Drive was extremely tense. The imminent arrival at their house of an assortment of wizards was making the Dursleys uptight and irritable. Uncle Vernon had looked downright alarmed when Harry informed him that the Weasleys would be arriving at 5 o'clock the very next day. "I hope you told them to dress properly, those people," he snarled at once. "I've seen the sort of stuff you lot wear. They'd better have the decency to put on normal clothes, that's all." Harry felt a slight sense of foreboding. He had rarely seen Mr. or Mrs. Weasley wearing anything that the Dursleys could call normal. Their children might don Muggle clothing during the holidays, but Mr. and Mrs. Weasley usually wore long robes in varying states of shabbiness. Harry wasn't bothered about what the neighbours would think, but he was anxious about how rude the Dursleys might be to the Weasleys if they turned up looking like their worst idea of wizards. Uncle Vernon had put on his best suit. To some people this might have looked like a gesture of welcome, but Harry knew it was because Uncle Vernon wanted to look impressive and intimidating. Dudley, on the other hand, looked somehow diminished. This was not because the diet was at last taking effect, but due to fright. Dudley had emerged from his last encounter with a fully grown wizard with a curly pig's tail poking out of the seat of his trousers, and Aunt Petunia and Uncle Vernon had had to pay for its removal at a private hospital in London. It wasn't altogether surprising, therefore, that Dudley kept running his hand nervously over his backside and walking sideways from room to room so as not to present the same target to the enemy. Lunch was an almost silent meal. Dudley didn't even protest at the food, cottage cheese and grated celery. Aunt Petunia wasn't eating anything at all. Her arms were folded, her lips were pursed, and she seemed to be chewing her tongue, as though biting back the furious diatribe she longed to throw at Harry. "They'll be driving, of course," Uncle Vernon barked across the table. Said Harry. He hadn't thought of that. How were the Weasleys going to pick him up? They didn't have a car anymore. The old Ford Anglia they had once owned was currently running wild in the Forbidden Forest at Hogwarts. But Mr. Weasley had borrowed a Ministry of Magic car last year. Possibly he would do the same today. "I think so," said Harry. Uncle Vernon snorted into his moustache. Normally Uncle Vernon would have asked what car Mr. Weasley drove. He tended to judge other men on how big and expensive their cars were, but Harry doubted whether Uncle Vernon would have taken to Mr. Weasley even if he drove a Ferrari. Harry spent most of the afternoon in his bedroom. He couldn't stand watching Aunt Petunia peer out through the net curtains every few seconds, as though there had been a warning about an escaped rhinoceros. Finally, at 5:15, Harry went back downstairs and into the living room. Aunt Petunia was compulsively straightening cushions. Uncle Vernon was pretending to read the paper, but his tiny eyes were not moving, and Harry was sure he was really listening with all his might for the sound of an approaching car. Dudley was crammed into an armchair, his porky hands beneath him, clamped firmly around his bottom. Harry couldn't take the tension. He left the room and went and sat on the stairs in the hall, his eyes on his watch and his heart pumping fast from excitement and nerves. But 5 o'clock came and then went. Uncle Vernon, perspiring slightly in his suit, opened the front door and peered up and down the street, then withdrew his head quickly. "They're late," he snarled at Harry. "I know," said Harry. "Maybe the traffic's bad or something." 5:10, then 5:15. Harry was starting to feel anxious himself now. At 5:30, he heard Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia conversing in terse mutters in the living room. "No consideration at all. We might have had an engagement. Maybe they think they'll get invited to dinner if they're late." "Well, they most certainly won't be," said Uncle Vernon, and Harry heard him stand up and start pacing the living room. "They'll take the boy and go. There'll be no hanging around. That's if they're coming at all. Probably mistaken the day. I dare say their kind don't set much store by punctuality. Either that, or they drive some tin-pot car that's broken. Ah!" Harry jumped up. From the other side of the living room door came the sounds of the three Dursleys scrambling, panic-stricken, across the room. Next moment Dudley came flying into the hall, looking terrified. "What happened?" said Harry. "What's the matter?" But Dudley didn't seem able to speak. Hands still clamped over his buttocks, he waddled as fast as he could into the kitchen. Harry hurried into the living room. Loud bangings and scrapings were coming from behind the Dursleys' boarded-up fireplace, which had a fake coal fire plugged in front of it. "What is it?" asked Aunt Petunia, who had backed into the wall and was staring, terrified, towards the fire. "What is it, Vernon?" But they were left in doubt barely a second longer. Voices could be heard from inside the blocked fireplace. "Ouch! Fred, no! Go back! Go back! There's been some kind of mistake! Tell George not to— Ouch! George, no! There's no room! Go back quickly and tell Ron." "Maybe Harry can hear us, Dad. Maybe he'll be able to let us out." There was a loud hammering of fists on the boards behind the electric fire. "Harry! Harry, can you hear us?" The Dursleys rounded on Harry like a pair of angry wolverines. "What is this?" growled Uncle Vernon. "What's going on?" They've tried to get here by flue powder," said Harry, fighting a mad desire to laugh. "They can travel by fire, only you've blocked the fireplace. Hang on." He approached the fireplace and called through the boards. "Mr. Weasley, can you hear me?" The hammering stopped. Somebody inside the chimney-piece said, "Shh! Mr. Weasley, it's Harry. The fireplace has been blocked up. You won't be able to get through there." "Damn," said Mr. Weasley's voice. "What on earth do they want to block up the fireplace for?" "They've got an electric fire," Harry explained. "Really?" said Mr. Weasley's voice excitedly. "Electric, you say? With a plug? Gracious, I must see that. Let's think. Ouch, Ron!" Ron's voice now joined the others. "What are we doing here? Has something gone wrong?" "Oh, no, Ron," came Fred's voice very sarcastically. "No, this is exactly where we wanted to end up." Yeah, we're having the time of our lives here," said George. whose voice sounded muffled, as though he was squashed against the wall. "Boys, boys," said Mr. Weasley vaguely. "I'm trying to think what to do. Yes, only way. Stand back, Harry." Harry retreated to the sofa. Uncle Vernon, however, moved forwards. "Wait a moment," he bellowed at the fire. "What exactly are you going to—" Bang! The electric fire shot across the room as the boarded-up fireplace burst outwards, expelling Mr. Weasley, Fred, George and Ron in a cloud of rubble and loose chippings. Aunt Petunia shrieked and fell backwards over the coffee table. Uncle Vernon caught her before she hit the floor and gaped speechless at the Weasleys, all of whom had bright red hair, including Fred and George, who were identical to the last freckle. "That's better," panted Mr. Weasley, brushing dust from his long green robes and straightening his glasses. "Ah, you must be Harry's aunt and uncle." Tall, thin and balding, he moved towards Uncle Vernon, his hand outstretched, but Uncle Vernon backed away several paces, dragging Aunt Petunia. Words utterly failed Uncle Vernon. His best suit was covered in white dust, which had settled in his hair and moustache and made him look as though he had just aged 30 years. Yes, sorry about that," said Mr. Weasley, lowering his hand and looking over the shoulder at the blasted fireplace. "It's all my fault. It just didn't occur to me that we wouldn't be able to get out at the other end. I had your fireplace connected to the flue network, you see. Just for an afternoon, you know, so we could get Harry. Muggle fireplaces aren't supposed to be connected, strictly speaking, but I've got a useful contact at the flue regulation panel, and he fixed it for me. I can put it right in a jiffy, though. Don't worry. I'll light a fire to send the boys back, and then I can repair your fireplace before I disapparate." Harry was ready to bet that the Dursleys hadn't understood a single word of this. They were still gaping at Mr. Weasley, thunderstruck. Aunt Petunia staggered upright again and hid behind Uncle Vernon. "Hello, Harry," said Mr. Weasley brightly. "Get your trunk ready?" "It's upstairs," said Harry, grinning back. "Well, we'll get it," said Fred at once. Winking at Harry, he and George left the room. They knew where Harry's bedroom was, having once rescued him from it in the dead of night. Harry suspected that Fred and George were hoping for a glimpse of Dudley. They had heard a lot about him from Harry. "Well," said Mr. Weasley, swinging his arm slightly, while he tried to find words to break the very nasty silence. Very nice place you've got here." As the usual spotless living room was now covered in dust and bits of brick, this remark didn't go down too well with the Dursleys. Uncle Vernon's face purpled once more, and Aunt Petunia started chewing her tongue again. However, they seemed too scared to actually say anything. Mr. Weasley was looking around. He loved everything to do with Muggles. Harry could see him itching to go and examine the television and the video recorder. "They run off electricity, do they?" he said knowledgeably. "Ah, yes, I can see the plugs. I collect plugs," he added to Uncle Vernon. "And batteries. Oh, got a very large collection of batteries. My wife thinks I'm mad, but there you are." Uncle Vernon clearly thought Mr. Weasley was mad too. He moved ever so slightly to the right, screening Aunt Petunia from view, as though he thought Mr. Weasley might suddenly run at them and attack. Dudley suddenly reappeared in the room. Harry could hear the clunk of his trunk on the stairs, and knew that the sounds had scared Dudley out of the kitchen. Dudley edged along the wall, gazing at Mr. Weasley with terrified eyes, and attempted to conceal himself behind his mother and father. Unfortunately, Uncle Vernon's bulk, while sufficient to hide bony Aunt Petunia, was nowhere near enough to conceal Dudley. "Ah, this is your cousin, is it, Harry?" said Mr. Weasley, taking another brave stab at making conversation. "Yep," said Harry. "That's Dudley." He and Ron exchanged glances, and then quickly looked away from each other. The temptation to burst out laughing was almost overwhelming. Dudley was still clutching his bottom as though afraid it might fall off. Mr. Weasley, however, seemed genuinely concerned at Dudley's peculiar behaviour. Indeed, from the tone of his voice when he next spoke, Harry was quite sure that Mr. Weasley thought Dudley was quite as mad as the Dursleys thought he was. Except that Mr. Weasley felt sympathy rather than fear. "Having a good holiday, Dudley?" he said kindly. Dudley whimpered. Harry saw his hands tighten still harder over his massive backside. Fred and George came back into the room, carrying Harry's school trunk. They glanced around as they entered and spotted Dudley. Their faces cracked into identical evil grins. "All right," said Mr. Weasley. "Better get cracking then." He pushed up the sleeves of his robes and took out his wand. Harry saw the Dursleys draw back against the wall as one. "Incendio!" said Mr. Weasley, pointing his wand at the hole in the wall behind him. Flames rose at once in the fireplace, crackling merrily, as though they had been burning for hours. Mr. Weasley took a small drawstring bag from his pocket, untied it, took a pinch of the powder inside and threw it into the flames, which turned emerald green and roared higher than ever. "Off you go then, Fred," said Mr. Weasley. "Coming," said Fred. "Oh no, hang on." A bag of sweets had spilled out of Fred's pocket, and the contents were now rolling in every direction. Big, fat toffees in brightly coloured wrappers. Fred scrambled around, cramming them back into his pocket, then gave the Dursleys a cheery wave, stepped forward and walked right into the fire, saying, "The burrow!" Aunt Petunia gave a little shuddering gasp. There was a whooshing sound, and Fred vanished. "Right then, George," said Mr. Weasley, "you and the trunk." Harry helped George carry the trunk forward into the flames and turn it onto its end so that he could hold it better. Then, with a second whoosh, George had cried, "The burrow!" and vanished too. "Ron, you next," said Mr. Weasley. "See ye," said Ron brightly to the Dursleys. He grinned broadly at Harry and then stepped into the fire, shouted, "The burrow!" and disappeared. Now Harry and Mr. Weasley alone remained. "Well, bye then," Harry said to the Dursleys. They didn't say anything at all. Harry moved towards the fire, but just as he reached the edge of the hearth, Mr. Weasley put out a hand and held him back. He was looking at the Dursleys in amazement. "Harry said goodbye to you," he said. "Didn't you hear him?" "It doesn't matter," Harry muttered to Mr. Weasley. "Honestly, I don't care." Mr. Weasley did not remove his hand from Harry's shoulder. "You aren't going to see your nephew till next summer," he said to Uncle Vernon in mild indignation. "Surely you're going to say goodbye." Uncle Vernon's face worked furiously. The idea of being taught consideration by a man who had just blasted away half of his living room still seemed to be causing him intense suffering. But Mr. Weasley's wand was still in his hand, and Uncle Vernon's tiny eyes darted to it once, before he said very resentfully, "Goodbye, then." "See you," said Harry, putting one foot forward into the green flames, which felt pleasantly like warm breath. At that moment, however, a horrible gagging sound erupted behind him, and Aunt Petunia started to scream. Harry wheeled around. Dudley was no longer standing behind his parents. He was kneeling beside the coffee table, and he was gagging and spluttering on a foot-long purple slimy thing that was protruding from his mouth. One bewildered second later, Harry realised that the foot-long thing was Dudley's tongue, and that a brightly coloured toffee wrapper lay on the floor before him. Aunt Petunia hurled herself into the ground beside Dudley, seized the end of his swollen tongue, and attempted to wrench it out of his mouth. Unsurprisingly, Dudley yelled and spluttered worse than ever, trying to fight her off. Uncle Vernon was bellowing and waving his arms around, and Mr. Weasley had to shout to make himself heard. "Not to worry, I can sort him out," he yelled, advancing on Dudley with his wand outstretched. But Aunt Petunia screamed worse than ever, and threw herself on top of Dudley, shielding him from Mr. Weasley. "No, really," said Mr. Weasley desperately. "It's a simple process. It was the toffee, my son Fred. A real practical joker. But it's only an engorgement charm. At least, I think it is. Please, I can correct it." But far from being reassured, the Dursleys became more panic-stricken. Aunt Petunia was sobbing hysterically, tugging Dudley's tongue as though determined to rip it out. Dudley appeared to be suffocating under the combined pressure of his mother and his tongue, and Uncle Vernon, who had lost control completely, seized a china figure from on top of the sideboard and threw it very hard at Mr. Weasley, who ducked, causing the ornament to shatter in the blasted fireplace. "Now, really," said Mr. Weasley angrily, brandishing his wand, "I'm trying to help." Bellowing like a wounded hippo, Uncle Vernon snatched up another ornament. "Harry, go, just go," Mr. Weasley shouted, his wand on Uncle Vernon. "I'll sort this out." Harry didn't want to miss the fun, but Uncle Vernon's second ornament narrowly missed his left ear, and on balance he thought it best to leave the situation to Mr. Weasley. He stepped into the fire, looked over his shoulder as he said, "The burrow." His last fleeting glimpse of the living room was of Mr. Weasley blasting a third ornament out of Uncle Vernon's hand with his wand, Aunt Petunia screaming and lying on top of Dudley, and Dudley's tongue lolling around like a great slimy python. But next moment Harry had begun to spin very fast, and the Dursleys' living room was whipped out of sight in a rush of emerald green flames. Chapter 5. Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. Harry spun faster and faster, elbows tucked slightly to his sides, blurred fireplaces flashing past him, until he started to feel sick and closed his eyes. Then, when at last he felt himself slowing down, he threw out his hands and brought himself to a halt in time, to prevent himself falling face forwards out of the Weasleys' kitchen fire. "Did he eat it?" said Fred excitedly, holding out a hand to pull Harry to his feet. "Yeah," said Harry, straightening up. "What was it?" "Tongue toffee," said Fred brightly. "George and I invented them. We've been looking for someone to test them on all summer." The tiny kitchen exploded with laughter. Harry looked around and saw that Ron and George were sitting at the scrubbed wooden table with two red-haired people Harry had never seen before. though he knew immediately they must be Bill and Charlie, the two eldest Weasley brothers. "How you doing, Harry?" said the nearer of the two, grinning at him and holding out a large hand, which Harry shook, feeling calluses and blisters under his fingers. This had to be Charlie, who worked with dragons in Romania. Charlie was built like the twins, shorter and stockier than Percy and Ron, who were both long and lanky. He had a broad, good-natured face, which was weather-beaten and so freckly that he looked almost tanned. His arms were muscly, and one of them had a large, shiny burn on it. Bill got to his feet, smiling, and also shook Harry's hand. Bill came as something of a surprise. Harry knew that he worked for the Wizarding Bank, Gringotts, that he had been head boy of Hogwarts, and had always imagined Bill to be an older version of Percy, fussy about rule-breaking, and fond of bossing everyone around. However, Bill was, there was no other word for it, cool. He was tall, with long hair that had to be tied back in a ponytail. He was wearing an earring with what looked like a fang dangling from it. His clothes would not have looked out of place at a rock concert, except that Harry recognised his boots to be made not of leather, but of dragon hide. Before any of them could say anything else, there was a faint popping noise, and Mr. Weasley appeared out of thin air at George's shoulder. He was looking angrier than Harry had ever seen him. "That wasn't funny, Fred," he shouted. "What on earth did you give that Muggle boy?" "I didn't give him anything," said Fred with another evil grin. "I just dropped it. It was his fault he went and ate it. I never told him to." "You dropped it on purpose," roared Mr. Weasley. "You knew he'd eat it. You knew he was on a diet." "How big did his tongue get?" George asked eagerly. "It was 4 foot long before his parents would let me shrink it." Harry and the Weasleys roared with laughter again. "It isn't funny," Mr. Weasley shouted. "That sort of behaviour seriously undermines wizard-muggle relations. I spent half my life campaigning against the mistreatment of muggles, and my own sons—" "We didn't give it to him because he was a muggle," said Fred indignantly. "No, we gave it to him because he's a great bully and git," said George. "Isn't he, Harry?" "Yeah, he is, Mr. Weasley," said Harry earnestly. "That's not the point," raged Mr. Weasley. "You wait until I tell your mother." "Tell me what?" said a voice behind them. Mrs. Weasley had just entered the kitchen. She was a short, plump woman with a very kind face, though her eyes were presently narrowed with suspicion. "Oh, hello, Harry dear," she said, spotting him and smiling. Then her eyes snapped back to her husband. "Tell me what, Arthur?" Mr. Weasley hesitated. Harry could tell that, however angry he was with Fred and George, he hadn't really intended to tell Mrs. Weasley what had happened. There was a silence while Mr. Weasley eyed his wife nervously. Then 2 girls appeared in the kitchen doorway behind Mrs. Weasley. One, with very bushy brown hair and rather large front teeth, was Harry and Ron's friend Hermione Granger. The other, who was small and red-haired, was Ron's younger sister, Ginny. Both of them smiled at Harry, who grinned back, which made Ginny go scarlet. She had been very taken with Harry ever since her first visit to the Burrow. "Tell me what, Arthur?" Mrs. Weasley repeated, in a dangerous sort of voice. "It's nothing, Molly," mumbled Mr. Weasley. "Fred and George just... But I've had words with them." "What have they done this time?" said Mrs. Weasley. "If it's got anything to do with Weasley's wizard wheezes—" "Why don't you show Harry where he's sleeping, Ron?" said Hermione from the doorway. "He knows where he's sleeping," said Ron. "In my room. He slept there last." "Well, we can all go," said Hermione pointedly. "Oh," said Ron, cottoning on. "Right. Yeah, I'll come too," said George. "You stay where you are," snarled Mrs. Weasley. Harry and Ron edged out of the kitchen, and they, Hermione and Ginny, set off along the narrow hallway and up the rickety staircase that zigzagged through the house to the upper stories. "What are Weasley's wizard wheezes?" Harry asked as they climbed. Ron and Ginny both laughed, although Hermione didn't. "Mum found this stack of order forms when she was cleaning Fred and George's rooms," said Ron quietly. "Great long price lists for stuff they've invented. Joke stuff, you know, fake wands and trick sweets. Loads of stuff. It was brilliant. I never knew they'd been inventing all that." "We've been hearing explosions out of their room for ages, but we never thought they were actually making things," said Ginny. "We thought they just liked the noise." "Only most of the stuff, well, all of it really, was a bit dangerous," said Ron. "And you know, they were planning to sell it at Hogwarts to make money. And Mum went mad at them, told them they weren't allowed to make any more of it, and burnt all the order forms. She's furious at them anyway. They didn't get as many owls as she expected." Owls were ordinary wizarding levels, the examinations Hogwarts students took at the age of 15. "And then there was the big row," Ginny said, "because Mum wants them to go to the Ministry of Magic like Dad, and they told her all they want to do is open a joke shop." Just then, a door on the second landing opened, and a face poked out, wearing horn-rimmed glasses and a very annoyed expression. "Hi, Percy," said Harry. "Oh, hello, Harry," said Percy. "I was wondering who was making all the noise. I'm trying to work in here, you know. I've got a report to finish for the office, and it's rather difficult to concentrate when people keep thundering up and down the stairs." "We're not thundering," said Ron irritably. "We're walking. Sorry if we've disturbed the top-secret workings of the Ministry of Magic." "What are you working on?" said Harry. "A report for the Department of International Magical Cooperation," said Percy smugly. "We're trying to standardise cauldron thickness. Some of these foreign imports are just a shade too thin. Leakages have been increasing at a rate of almost 3% a year." "That'll change the world, that report will," said Ron. "Front page at the Daily Prophet, I expect. Cauldron leaks." Percy went slightly pink. "You might sneer, Ron," he said heartedly, "but unless some sort of international law is imposed, we might well find the market flooded with flimsy, shallow-bottomed products, which seriously endanger—" Yeah, all right," said Ron, and he started off upstairs again. Percy slammed his bedroom door shut. As Harry, Hermione and Ginny followed Ron up 3 more flights of stairs, shouts from the kitchen below echoed up to them. It sounded as though Mr. Weasley had told Mrs. Weasley about the toffees. The room at the top of the house, where Ron slept, looked much as it had done the last time that Harry had come to stay. The same posters of Ron's favourite Quidditch team, the Chudley Cannons, were whirling and waving on the walls and sloping ceiling, and the fish tank on the windowsill, which had previously held frog spawn, now contained one extremely large frog. Ron's old rat Scabbers was here no more, but instead there was the tiny grey owl that had delivered Ron's letter to Harry in Privet Drive. It was hopping up and down in a small cage and twittering madly. "Shut up, pig," said Ron, edging his way between the 2 of the 4 beds that had been squeezed into the room. "Fred and George are in here with us, because Bill and Charlie are in their room," he told Harry. "Percy gets to keep his room all to himself because he's got to work." Why are you calling that owl pig?" Harry asked Ron. "Because he's being stupid," said Ginny. "Its proper name is Pigwidgeon." "Yeah, and that's not a stupid name at all," said Ron sarcastically. "Ginny named him," he explained to Harry. "She reckons it's sweet, and I tried to change it, but it was too late. He won't answer to anything else, so now he's Pig. I've got to keep him up here because he annoys Errol and Hermes. He annoys me too, come to that." Pigwidgeon zoomed happily about his cage, hooting shrilly. Harry knew Ron too well to take him seriously. He had moaned continually about his old rat Scabbers, but had been most upset when Hermione's cat Crookshanks appeared to have eaten him. "Where's Crookshanks?" Harry asked Hermione now. "Out in the garden, I expect," she said. "He likes chasing gnomes. He's never seen any before." "Percy's enjoying work then," said Harry, sitting down on one of the beds and watching the Chudley Cannon zooming in and out of the posters on the ceiling. "Enjoying it?" said Ron darkly. "I don't reckon he'd come home if Dad didn't make him. He's obsessed. Just don't get him onto the subject of his boss. According to Mr. Crouch, as I was saying to Mr. Crouch is of the opinion, Mr. Crouch was telling me, they'll be announcing their engagement any day now." "Have you had a good summer, Harry?" said Hermione. "Did you get our food parcels and everything?" "Yeah, thanks a lot," said Harry. "They saved my life, those cakes." "And have you heard from—" Ron began, but at a look from Hermione, he fell silent. Harry knew Ron had been about to ask about Sirius. Ron and Hermione had been so deeply involved in helping Sirius escape from the Ministry of Magic that they were almost as concerned about Harry's godfather as he was. However, discussing him in front of Ginny was a bad idea. Nobody but themselves and Professor Dumbledore knew about how Sirius had escaped, or believed in his innocence. "I think they've stopped arguing," said Hermione, to cover the awkward moment, because Ginny was looking curiously from Ron to Harry. "Should we go down and help your mum with dinner?" "Yeah, all right," said Ron. The 4 of them left Ron's room and went back downstairs to find Mrs. Weasley alone in the kitchen, looking extremely bad-tempered. "We're eating out in the garden," she said when they came in. "There's just not room for 11 people in here. Could you take the plates outside, girls? Bill and Charlie are setting up the tables. Knives and forks, please, you two," she said to Ron and Harry, pointing her wand a little more vigorously than she'd intended at a pile of potatoes in the sink, which shot out of their skins so fast that they ricocheted off the walls and ceilings. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she snapped, now directing her wand at a dustpan, which hopped off the side and started skating across the floor, scooping up the potatoes. "Those two," she burst out savagely, now pulling pots and pans out of a cupboard, and Harry knew she meant Fred and George. "I don't know what's going to happen to them. I really don't. No ambition, unless you count making as much trouble as they possibly can." She slammed a large copper saucepan down on the kitchen table and began to wave her wand around inside it. A creamy sauce poured from the wand tip as she stirred. It's not as though they haven't got brains, she continued irritably, taking the saucepan over to the stove and lighting it with a further poke of her wand. But they're wasting them, and unless they pull themselves together soon, they'll be in real trouble. I've had more owls from Hogwarts about them than the rest of you put together. If they carry on the way they're going, they'll end up in front of the improper use of magic office. Mrs. Weasley jabbed her wand at the cutlery drawer, which shot open. Harry and Ron both jumped out of the way as several knives soared out of it, flew across the kitchen and began chopping the potatoes, which had just tipped back into the sink by the dustpan. I don't know where we went wrong with them, said Mrs. Weasley, putting down her wand and starting to pull out still more saucepans. It's been the same for years, one thing after another, and they won't listen to... Oh, not again! She had picked up her wand from the table, and it had emitted a loud squeak and turned into a giant rubber mouse. One of their fake wands again, she shouted. How many times have I told those two not to leave them lying around? She grabbed her real wand and turned around to find that the sauce on the stove was smoking. Come on, Rod said hurriedly to Harry, seizing a handful of cutlery from the open drawer. Let's go and help Bill and Charlie. They left Mrs. Weasley and headed out of the back door into the yard. They had only gone a few paces when Hermione's bandy-legged ginger cat, Crookshanks, came pelting out of the garden, bottle-brush tail held high in the air, chasing what looked like a muddy potato on legs. Harry recognised it instantly as a gnome. Barely 10 inches high, its horny little feet pattered very fast as it sprinted across the yard and dived headlong into one of the Wellington boots that lay scattered around the door. Harry could hear the gnome giggling madly as Crookshanks inserted a paw into the boot, trying to reach it. Meanwhile, a very loud crashing noise was coming from the other side of the house. The source of the commotion was revealed as they entered the garden and saw that Bill and Charlie both had their wands out and were making two battered old tables fly high above the lawn, smashing into each other, each attempting to knock the others out of the air. Fred and George were cheering, Ginny was laughing, and Hermione was hovering near the hedge, apparently torn between amusement and anxiety. Bill's table caught Charlie's with a huge bang and knocked one of its legs off. There was a clatter from overhead, and they all looked up to see Percy's head poking out of the window on the second floor. "Will you keep it down?" he bellowed. "Sorry, Perce," said Bill, grinning. "How are the cauldron bottoms coming on?" "Very badly," said Percy peevishly, and he slammed the window shut again. Chuckling, Bill and Charlie directed the tables safely onto the grass, end to end, and then with a flick of his wand, Bill reattached the table leg and conjured tablecloths from nowhere. By 7 o'clock, the two tables were groaning under dishes and dishes of Mrs. Weasley's excellent cooking, and the 9 Weasleys, Harry and Hermione, were settling themselves down to eat beneath a clear, deep blue sky. To somebody who had been living on meals of increasingly stale cake all summer, this was a paradise, and at first Harry listened rather than talked, as he helped himself to chicken and ham pie, boiled potatoes and salad. At the far end of the table, Percy was telling his father all about his report on Cauldron Bottoms. "I've told Mr. Crouch that I'll have it ready by Tuesday," Percy was saying pompously. "That's a bit sooner than he expected it, but I like to keep on top of things. I think he'll be grateful I've done it in good time. I mean, it's extremely busy in our department just now, what with all the arrangements for the World Cup. We're just not getting the support we need from the Department of Magical Games and Sports. Ludo Bagman—" "I like Ludo," said Mr. Weasley mildly. "He was the one who got us those good tickets for the Cup. I did him a bit of a favour. His brother, Otto, got into a spot of trouble. A lawnmower with unnatural powers. I smoothed the whole thing over." "Oh, Bagman's likeable enough, of course," said Percy dismissively. "But how he ever got to be head of department, when I compare him to Mr. Crouch, I can't see Mr. Crouch losing a member of our department and not trying to find out what's happened to them. You realise Bertha Jorkins had been missing for over a month now. Went on holiday to Albania, never came back." "Yes, I was asking Ludo about that," said Mr. Weasley, frowning. "He says Bertha's got lost plenty of times before, though I must say it was someone in my department. If it was someone in my department, I'd be worried." "Oh, Bertha's hopeless, all right," said Percy. "I hear she's been shunted from department to department for years. Much more trouble than she's worth. But all the same, Bagman ought to be trying to find her. Mr. Crouch has been taking a personal interest. She worked in our department at one time, you know, and I think Mr. Crouch was quite fond of her, but Bagman just keeps laughing and saying she probably misread the map and ended up in Australia instead of Albania. However," Percy heaved an impressive sigh and took a deep swig of elderflower wine, "we've got quite enough on our plates at the Department of International Magical Cooperation without trying to find members of our departments too. As you know, we've got another big event to organise right after the World Cup." He cleared his throat significantly and looked down towards the end of the table where Harry, Ron and Hermione were sitting. You know the one I'm talking about, Father? He raised his voice slightly. The top secret one. Ron rolled his eyes and muttered to Harry and Hermione. He's been trying to get us to ask what the event is ever since he started work. Probably an exhibition of thick-bottomed cauldrons. In the middle of the table, Mrs. Weasley was arguing with Bill about his earring. Just seemed to be a recent acquisition. With a horrible great fang on it, really, Bill. What do they say at the bank? Mum, no one at the bank gives a damn how I dress as long as I bring home plenty of treasure, said Bill patiently. And your hair's getting really silly, dear, said Mrs. Weasley, fingering her wand lovingly. I wish you'd let me give it a trim. I like it, said Ginny, who was sitting beside Bill. You're so old-fashioned, Mum. Anyway, it's nowhere near as long as Professor Dumbledore's. Next to Mrs. Weasley, Fred, George and Charlie were all talking spiritedly about the World Cup. It's got to be Ireland, said Charlie thickly, through a mouthful of potato. They flattened Peru in the semi-finals. Bulgaria have got Victor Krum, though, said Fred. Krum's one decent player. Ireland have got 7, said Charlie shortly. I wish England had got through, though. That was embarrassing, that was. What happened, said Harry eagerly, regretting more than ever his isolation from the wizarding world when he was stuck in Privet Drive. Harry was passionate about Quidditch. He had played as Seeker on the Gryffindor House Quidditch team ever since his first year at Hogwarts and owned a Firebolt, one of the best racing brooms in the world. Went down to Transylvania, 390-10, said Charlie gloomily. Shocking performance. And Wales lost to Uganda, and Scotland was slaughtered by Luxembourg. Mr. Weasley conjured up candles to light the darkening garden before they had their pudding, homemade strawberry ice cream. And by the time they'd finished, moths were fluttering low over the table, and the warm air was perfumed with the smells of grass and honeysuckle. Harry was feeling extremely well fed and at peace with the world as he watched several gnomes sprinting through the rose bushes, laughing madly and closely pursued by Crookshanks. Ron looked carefully up at the table to check that the rest of the family were all busy talking. Then he said very quietly to Harry, So, have you heard from Sirius lately? Hermione looked round, listening closely. Yeah, said Harry softly, twice. He sounds okay. I wrote to him the day before yesterday. He might write back while I'm here. He suddenly remembered the reason he had written to Sirius, and for a moment was on the verge of telling Ron and Hermione about his scar hurting again, and about the dream which had woken him. But he really didn't want to worry them just now, not when he himself was feeling so happy and peaceful. Look at the time, said Mrs. Weasley, checking her wristwatch. You really should be in bed, the whole lot of you. You'll be up at the crack of dawn to get to the cup. Harry, if you leave your school list out, I'll get your things for you tomorrow in Diagon Alley. I'm getting everyone else's. There might not be time after the World Cup. The match went on for 5 days last time. Wow, hope it does this time, said Harry enthusiastically. Well, I certainly don't, said Percy sanctimoniously. I shudder to think what the state of my in-tray would be if I was away from work for 5 days. Yeah, someone might slip dragon dung in it again, eh, Percy? Said Fred. What? That was a sample of fertiliser from Norway, said Percy, going very red in the face. It was nothing personal. It was, Fred whispered to Harry as they got up from the table. We sent it. Thank you for listening to the first part of this amazing Harry Potter story. If you'd like to listen to the rest of this story and all the other Harry Potter books, plus loads more stories and adventures and audiobooks and so much more, please visit my Patreon page and support my work. That would be much appreciated. Thank you very much.